Seaside Seduction, How the Moderns Lost Their Stays. This lecture is about cultural perceptions of the recent past during the 1930s. The actors are mainly artists and writers, but there could be some theme music playing in the background, such as William Walton's accompaniments for Edith Sitwell's poems in Facade, first performed in 1922. That parodic, zany, but largely affectionate way of remaking the recent past, with the seaside as a frequent point of reference, played a large but often underrepresented role in the period, and I'm working my way back there through the door that is opened, coming right at the end of the period, John Piper's Brighton Aquatints, a book published in November 1939. I have known this book a long time, as I was lucky enough to be able to look at it at home since my father bought a copy of the coloured edition in 1942, a copy that I now have. This is it. I felt it was a pity that people couldn't turn all the pages and look at all the pictures and read all the words without going to a specialist library, so I suggested to Tim Mainstone of the Mainstone Press that we might follow up a reprint of Eric Ravilius's 1938 book, High Street, which we'd done, with a similar treatment for Brighton Aquatints. Here's the new book on showing the cover. On both occasions, it was possible to establish in an introductory text the stages by which these rather unusual books came into existence. Although issued by mainstream publishers, and in the case of Brighton Aquatints, that was Gerald Duckworth, both should be categorized as artists' books in my way, or as the French would say, livres d'artistes. The artists in both cases originated the project and found the publishers and also the authors in the case of High Street. But the art came first. They were both experimenting with printmaking techniques that were new to them, but which in themselves had an evocative history. Hand-drawn lithography in Ravilius's case, and aquatint for Piper. During the years these books were produced, the two artists, born in the same year, 1903, now in their later 30s and quite well established, got to know each other through a network of mutual friends, so there's a connection here, and both could be claimed as products of a wider group project, as I will partially explain. Both books are about places and things of a rather old-fashioned and nostalgic quality, things that have survived by neglect and may now be threatened by modernization. Now, the title of this talk, How the Moderns Lost Their Stays, implies a process of liberation. The bathers, in my first slide, we'll go back to that, are no longer wearing the corsets that we imagine were encumbering their earlier counterparts. Liberating the body, especially the female body, was one of the achievements of the early 20th century. Similarly, modern art was meant to be a liberation from literalism, from subject matter, and narrative from sentimentality. In Britain in the 1930s, this meant a move to abstraction, which some saw as the ultimate goal of freedom. Piper is the classic case of an artist who found abstraction, tried it, and then reverted. So it is not surprising that he takes us on this particular journey through his door. Here is a typical abstract painting by Piper from 1935, and a text from the following year in which he expresses a desire for a different kind of change. Brighton Aquatints was part of that change. Here we see this intense, gaunt young man. He never really looked young at any point in his life, so far as I can see. And he is matched to a text by his friend Anthony West, expressing very well, I think, his dilemma in the 1930s. In 1935, Piper had been embraced by what amounted to the abstract establishment in British art. He was a new recruit, he was rather a star. It was a small and evangelical group, And West's text identifies them with Park Hill Road, Hampstead, where Ben Nicholson, Barbara Hepworth, Henry Moore, and briefly Pete Mondrian were living, together with their supporter, the critic and historian Herbert Reed. On the outbreak of war in 1939, Nicholson and Hepworth went to St Ives in Cornwall, where they were joined by the sculptor Naum Garbo, and these locations are taken here to represent a purist and dogmatic attitude to art, which they certainly possessed. Artists who did not toe the line were excommunicated from their exhibiting groups, and Piper deliberately diverged from them, not in a hostile spirit, but determined not to be tied down in this way. His wife-to-be, Mfanwy Evans, shared the journey, and their travelogue was a magazine, Axis, that she edited between 1935 and 1938. So it was, in a sense, an event played out in public, albeit to a rather small public. Much of this story, as it affected artists, writers, and others in the same generation, has been told by Alexandra Harris in Romantic Moderns, where Piper represents the end point of the journey. Where I take some issue with her account is that the two sides of the split are represented there as conflicting and irreconcilable positions. For her, the moderns are the baddies, the mean-spirited and rigid thinifers, to borrow the terminology of André Maurois' fable, while the romantics are the fatty puffs, the hedonists with a taste for comfort. I find it, though, a more complicated minuet of changing positions with more than two sides. If the metaphor of undergarments, losing your stays, can be extended, while there were a few unreformed thinifers, there were also some pseudo-thinifers who were constraining their real instincts and learnt over time that they did not need to suffer against their nature. Piper was certainly one of these. There is a fundamental truth here about human nature, about the division of people into the Puritans and the Roundhead and the Cavaliers, if you like. And during the 1920s and 1930s, this was taken to be part of a much wider historical schema. For example, in the popular book by R.H. Tawney, now rather forgotten, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, 1926. Protestantism, in particular, was blamed for the hard-hearted doctrines adopted in the 19th century concerning economics that had brought misery to many lives and stunted the capacity for enjoyment for the mass of people. So there was a political angle to this whole story about liberating. During the 1930s, there was also an interesting shift of attitudes, so that the seaside in life and art became a good place to observe what was going on. It was an age informed by Freud and Jung's studies of the subconscious. The seaside was a place where inhibitions could be discarded as well as undergarments, literally in the form of clothes and sexual behavior, and also in terms of melting the barriers of class and taste. There are many pieces of writing picking up these themes. From the Sitwells, the three siblings who spent long periods of their childhood in pre-1914 Scarborough, to the progressive left-wing poets, Auden, MacNeice, and their circle. Another member of this generation, Osbourne Lancaster, created a new genre of architectural comic writing that began, as you see here, when he invented a fictitious seaside resort called Pelvis Bay in 1934, and made a series of drawings and texts that appeared at intervals in the Architectural Review. Here's a review by a slightly po-faced town planner who does get the fact that this is actually a joke. This is him reviewing the book version. Part of the joke is that in the text, where it's written like a rather po-faced but rather boosterish kind of civic guidebook, saying how all these Regency houses in rather bad taste have been cleared away to make room for proper modern buildings. And you can see in this text here the modified Renaissance, the Moorish style, Neo-Egyptian, things we might rather appreciate now, I think, if they survived, but here they are seen as bad taste. And here's the jacket of the book version that came out in 1936. And one can see, actually, Lancaster really seems to like everything. With Lancaster and his friends, such as John Betjeman, who was responsible for the playful and anarchic side of the Architectural Review while working there from 1930 to 1935, there was always a deliberate ambiguity concerning what was good and what was bad good, that is, what is bad in a funny or attractive way, as well as what was plain bad. This is the mode of camp, where the game is to keep everyone guessing and to challenge one's own assumptions. You win the game by persuading people that something they always thought to be in bad taste is actually marvelous. Often the board on which the game is played is marked in divisions representing historical periods. And there is a dangerous edge over which you have to leap into the next period. While modernism is a way of trying to opt out of the game by imposing absolute standards of value, it too can be co-opted against its will and become funny. Writing her essay Notes on Camp in 1964, Susan Sontag conveyed the seriousness of camp's mission in terms of creating tolerance and compassion for the human condition it represents. In the view of those who espouse camp, the world will never be made perfect, and we will only cause damage if we try. Better to accept and enjoy its imperfections. At Oxford, Lancaster had been part of a group of friends in the 1920s who made Victorian things a provocative form of protest, typical camp strategy. This is one of the few drawings to capture that moment of wax fruit and whatnots. They had the pleasure of their proposed 1840 exhibition being banned by the university proctors, which was surely far more satisfactory than if it had simply gone ahead unmolested. The idea behind this protest had an enormous take-up, however, although more in popular culture, fashion, films, musicals, and fashion. Sorry, I said fashion already, than in high culture. That is to say, around 1930, you get journalists saying, well, we're all neo-Victorian now. It's quite hard to see the evidence, but I think it was in terms of clothes as much as anything. John Piper, seen here with Osbourne Lancaster, they became very close friends and collaborators later on, made a perceptive comment in a review of Lancaster's later book, Pillar to Post, in 1938, saying it was time to move beyond satire and to take at least some of the Victorians at their proper value, although even in doing this, there is potential for camp. So it keeps spinning on its own axis, in a sense. Do we take the Albert Memorial seriously? Yes, we do, but we still find it quite funny. So it's very hard to pin down exactly what people think, but I think he's serious here about Ruskin, who had been a considerable figure of fun. And it's interesting how in this text he's commending Kenneth Clarke's book, The Gothic Revival, in which indeed Ruskin is taken seriously. And I like the way this ends, where he writes, after all, Mr. Lancaster himself is one of the chief cogs in the wheel that has turned from the malicious humour of eminent Victorians to the admiring patronage of 60 glorious years. So the Victorians are no longer quite the same joke that they were. And I made this chart a few years ago for a lecture on Victorian revival, which is only really scraping the surface, but it shows partly a chronological progression sideways from Strachey's Eminent Victorians in 1918, the book that really started this sequence of questioning, while I think to some extent actually celebrating more than people realize. Anyway, he followed it up with his book on Queen Victoria, which has a rather different tone to it, but still the Victorians are screamingly funny, really, and Strachey is a very camp figure to deal with them. So is Virginia Woolf with her domestic drama, Freshwater, 1923. But in the vertical axis, we move from satire and camp up towards scholarship and appreciation, with the figure of H.S. Goodhart Rendell coming in very early and taking the stuff quite seriously, as he continued to do. ditto Kenneth Clarke up there, taking it seriously until we get to 1934, when there's something of a moment of Victorian revival with a collection of essays edited by G.M. Young, Early Victorian England, which lived on in the form of his introduction called Portrait of an Age, which takes Victorian very seriously indeed, as well as being written in a lightweight sort of manner. So you see Brighton Aquitance here is sort of somewhere at the end of a 20-year cycle, if you like, of reappraisal. Although it isn't really about Victorian. Victorian comes into it, but the majority of it is actually about Regency. But Regency itself had been through this phase of dismissal, followed by acceptability and indeed enthusiasm, which really it had reached by 1930. Interior decoration, film and fiction had adopted it, perhaps as an analogue of their own period, the sense of world weariness that the Regency seemed to project, a degree of cynicism about the world in general. So there was this sort of sweet spot, as you might call it, tipping point between Regency and Victorian, with a loss of Georgian grace and a heavier classicism coming on with the beginnings of the Gothic revival that was a particular focus of interest in the 1930s. Although there was much concern for earlier Georgian in taste terms, that was slightly old hat by now, and it was this edge that was getting to be interesting. The revival of Regency, the reason I've chosen this picture, was very much stimulated by the demolition of the old Regent Street, which you can see happening here. It was a long, painful process, and John Nash's original buildings were hacked away, as you can see here, and replaced by something bigger, solider, uglier. And so there was an argument about architectural decorum, what was appropriate, what was proper. Nash was seen to fulfill those criteria, which also fed into the doctrines of modernism, that there was a sort of correct pitch, as it were, of taste. And what came afterwards in Regent Street, what we see there today, was for many people a vindication of why Nash was right and why the next leap should be into something maybe represented by modernism in terms of its restraint. Now, I was talking about camp earlier, and Piper is not normally seen as a representative of camp. Indeed, in quite a lot of his work, there's nothing particularly camp about it. But there is, however, I would say, a rather high-pitched performative approach to life and work that has a hint of this, more than a hint. And I think it comes from his fear of mediocrity and boredom that comes over from his early life. He's dissatisfied with his parental background. He's dissatisfied with the state of art. He's always searching, and with meeting Myfanwy, the editor of Axis, they both joined in this search for something. They weren't going to be put off with any easy answers. Brighton Aquitance, I think, is an example of rather high-level camp, and everything about the book contributes to this. There's the deliberately historical character of the typography, very carefully chosen, even though by 1939, this revival of Figgins shaded and Thorn shaded, which you see on the book label, was really quite commonly seen. The selection of the buildings themselves was often provocative. Here we have the Metropole Hotel, designed by Alfred Waterhouse, a building that really, I think, would have been sincerely hated by everybody as a Victorian monstrosity, they might have called it. But Piper describes it as this extraordinary inanimate stage turn. It's like a comic actor coming on the stage with the Brighton front. So it really gets his approval, and he makes it the subject of this particular print. But there's another character in this, and that is, oh yes, sorry, there's another picture showing the West Pier in the coloured version of the book. Another character who comes in, and that is John Betjeman, who had got to know Piper around 1936, commissioned one of the Shell guides from him for Oxfordshire, and they became fast friends. They had a shared sense of humour and jokes, and they developed a sort of act together. What I'm showing here is Betjeman's first book, Ghastly Good Taste, with its Victorian typography, not unlike Brighton Aquatints, that in fact is not really echoed by the contents of the book. He was getting ahead of himself already, because in the book, Victorian architecture is more condemned than praised. He has not yet become the familiar Betjeman figure that we know. But in terms of Brighton Aquatints, part of Betjeman's contribution was to invite Lord Alfred Douglas, who you see here, Bosie of Oscar Wilde notoriety, who at this stage in his old age was living in Hove in a basement flat. And Betjeman, as so often, he sort of cultivated him as a friend and also as something of a joke. So to get his preface in Brighton Aquatints was a bit of a coup, and Bosie seems to have been very pleased to earn 5 guineas. Most of his income was made up of the proceeds from libel suits that he liked to conduct against newspapers. And there's Nancy Mitford, an appropriate figure, sitting in the middle of this eminently fake boat in a photographer's studio. It's a wonderful photograph, and I'm very glad we were able to get hold of a copy from John Murray and put it in the book. So there's lots of fun and games here, lots of laughter, but how does this relate to the world of serious modern architecture? John Betjeman worked on the Architectural Review, as I think I already said, from 1930 to 1935. He was responsible for many things, I think. He got to know the leading modern architects and was for a time quite enthusiastic about what they were doing. But he also introduced Osbourne Lancaster's flippancy into the magazine. He wasn't the only one, but I think he stirred this up very effectively, and his own contributions are fairly obvious during those years. But I think an interesting thing happens when it comes to the way that a major seaside modernist building, the Delaware Pavilion, is represented in the magazine in June 1937. Here is the pavilion itself as it is now on the left, after much careful work on it, as it was originally seen from the air in the context of the awful redness of this terrible town, as Charles Riley called it, a very strong contrast, perhaps rather camp in itself in that sense. Here is the caption from the Architectural Review of there being a problem to be tackled in an unprejudiced way, and achieving an affinity to the airy, unrestricted life that people come to the seaside to enjoy. This is the place where you take your stays off, metaphorically. You feel liberated. I think one still does. So far, affirmation on that count. But the graphic presentation of this feature in the magazine is really telling rather a different story. The issue, when you open it, has this as a kind of frontispiece, Me and My Gal at Brighton. And even more sort of curious and surprising is that this is a photograph by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who you see here, the famous figure from the Bauhaus. Here is a text by his wife Sybil, explaining how when he came to Britain in 1935, he really liked a great deal that he found, and saw the surface of eccentricity as representing something deeper in terms of a tolerance that wasn't present in Germany. England was the country of the amateur. It was his country. He wasn't really an amateur, I don't think, but he was a very somebody who moved swiftly from one thing to another. He covered a lot of ground. So one's not really expecting the Bauhaus to come up with a rather surrealist picture such as this, with the photographer's painted screen, the little child's sort of horse tricycle, whatever it is, that's just semi-off stage on the left, and then the blankness of the beach. These are all sort of juxtaposed, isolated objects, including the sense of those open faces looking into the distance. I assume he borrowed these objects and put them on the beach and took the picture rather than finding them there. But with him, you never know. There you can see him, bottom left, in the process of doing his photographic shoot of the Delaware Pavilion for the Architectural Review. Interestingly, Moholy-Nagy seems to have known John Piper quite a long way back, certainly before he himself came to England. And he became friends with John Betjeman too. They had a lot of fun together when they were working on this project, the book called An Oxford University Chest, Betjeman's text and Moholy's photographs of different aspects of Oxford life. So these are not separate worlds. They are actually living together, laughing together, even if there are differences between them. In this feature in the Architectural Review, the first piece of text is actually by Osbourne Lancaster himself, appropriate choice. Here, really setting out this group idea that the Victorians are not to be dismissed. They had something special that the present of that time didn't have. And I think this generation, they're looking back to their own childhoods, really. In his memoirs, Lancaster talks about having his 6th birthday at Littlehampton-on-Sea, where his family used to go, which just happened to be the day that the First World War broke out. So it was rather memorable, and all the German bands disappeared from the promenade. But I think in this passage here, this phrase, the revival of sin, is rather wonderful. That the 1930s appreciated that. Of course, they might have had a slightly superior Freudian view of it, but they could still relish the naughtiness attributed to the Regency and the late Victorians, which is evident in this text. But by way of contrast, Serge Tremaeff himself, the co-designer of the pavilion, wrote this pseudonymous piece that follows after Lancaster's, which really appears to be rather stern, saying there's a lot of rubbish around on the seaside and we need to get rid of it. It's paradoxical, though. He is complaining about a world of depressing uniformity, but is he not actually asking for a different kind of uniformity? It's rather hard to tell. Moholy, I think, is subverting him already by inserting that photograph with this rather delightful detail of chair and a goat, a special parking space for these, for presumably elderly persons to be driven gently along the promenade in Brighton, which we see here. The complaint really in the caption is about the number of sort of intermediate layers you get between the road and the beach, which seems slightly unnecessary, in my view anyway. But there's, I think, a constructive play here between different viewpoints. Not everything needs to be frivolous, but the seaside becomes a solvent, a sort of searchlight of truth that exposes the false while making the real stand out, even if people may position the line between them differently. Part of the same feature showed this group of modernist buildings around the coast, one of these being Embassy Court, just over the boundary in Hove, still fortunately standing, designed by Wells Coates, butted up against Regency terraces and towering over them. This is presented with an entirely straight face here. There's no satire about that. But I'm moving on here to another book from 1934 in this case, but they're all sort of grouped in the middle years of the 30s. This evokes this famous tune, I Do Like to Be Beside the Seaside, the one which appears in William Walton's Facade Music for when Don Pasquito arrived at the seaside and all that. It was something that I think must have run in the heads of a whole generation. They'd all grown up on this. Yvonne Cloud is an interesting figure. Here are a few details at the end of this quote. Cloud was a pseudonym. She was a journalist, a communist, and later biographer of Eleanor Marx. And she put together this book of essays by a lot of young intellectuals, fashionable folk of the time. But her introduction is really looking back with unmixed nostalgia for a pre-First World War seaside, I think. Music, which combined with sunshine and sea air would have made a cat strut. And I've paired it up with this rather wonderful painting by Sickert, which of course has many inferences. The fact that it is 1915 and there's a war being fought not that far away on the other side of the channel. But I think the nature of these shows on the beach, this sort of tail end of a commedia dell'arte tradition, which was still in some way authentic. This tugged at the heartstrings of later sophisticates whose upbringing with the writings of the Sitwells would have taught them to understand that there was an elusive relationship between tinsel and real gold. You know, these are not great actors, they are not performing great material, but somehow there's a magic about it. So this is part of the reevaluation, I think, that comes with looking again at the seaside. Furthermore, there's this project by the Mass Observation group, which was founded in 1937. One of the first things they did, as well as recording the coronation of George VI, was to recruit observers in Blackpool to listen to what people were saying, to try and discover. They took their techniques from anthropology, and really the premise of this was that Britain was in many ways a foreign country, even to its own inhabitants. Nobody really knew how the other half lived, and so that's what they hoped to find out through these little documentary snippets, as well as photographs, in this case by Humphrey Spender. And in some ways, this takes us back to the Sitwells again. This is a book of poems by Osbert Sitwell, one of Edith's two brothers, which is directly inspired by his childhood in Scarborough. and written about strange personalities. But I'm not quoting the poems themselves, but rather this text that stands as an epigraph, which itself is quite mysterious. I read it and thought this says in so many ways what I am trying to say about the physical and psychological states to be found by northern seas and northern races among those who worship or do not worship at reformed altars. So this is a criticism of the Protestant outlook, the killjoy, the sort of dour spirit of the north, which the seaside can somehow mitigate and give life back to these poor people who are suffering from these doctrines. It was quite a common view at that time, and certainly runs through all the Sitwell writing, which has a great preference for Mediterranean culture. And also this observation, which I think applies to the architectural theme and to what John Piper did. To the artist, the very ordinary is so extraordinary as, when submitted to the fires of his temperament and his capacity for observation, to be able to inspire him. So nothing is too ordinary for the artist who has the right eye for it. And that is, in a way, applied to the subject of the poetry, these odd, eccentric people who hung out in Scarborough. But there's also something very odd about Roland de Caulaincourt. I thought, as one does, I'll look up this person, try and get the dates of his life, find out something about him on the internet. Total blank. No copies of this title in library catalogues. I begin to think actually he's been invented by Osbert Sitwell. He's a bit of a practical joke. It was certainly not beyond him to do a thing like that. So if anybody who hears this lecture knows anything about Roland de Caulaincourt, I'd love to hear from them. But meanwhile, even if it's Osbert Sitwell sort of impersonating this fictional figure, it's a very interesting observation. And this idea of architectural toleration is most strongly represented in this particular page of John Piper's Brighton Aquatints, where it's an absolutely real situation, and I've got it in a photograph there, although there's a certain sort of elision, I think, in how Piper's grouped these buildings. You have three styles, mixed styles: Regency, Victorian, modern. Sorry, there's a proofing error there. This was a proof copy, I think, of the text, so don't worry about that. I've only just spotted it. But here is Piper's description. Each of these buildings in design and materials belongs very much to its own age, and each is excellent of its kind. So away with this discrimination that one period must be the best and must exclude all the others. You can have them all. And if you're losing your stays as a modernist, this, I think, is where you end up. You don't simply jump to another ship. You, as it were, go on all the ships at once. And what was perhaps a competition becomes a form of a dance instead. So we can follow up Piper's theory of the seaside in quite a lot of his writings at this time, which have been, in fact, rather brilliantly collected by Lord Levinson in a box set of volumes, all reproduced in facsimile from the original sources, if you can get hold of that. He was very busy as a writer. It was actually part of his income at that time to write reviews and articles. So we can read his thoughts and track their development through time. This is quite a key piece, though, the nautical style. His first article for the Architectural Review, or the Archie Rev, as Betjeman liked to call it, which is an exercise in seeking an essence of seaside architecture, much of it informal and anonymous. At the seaside, he suggests, we find the constraints of class and style in architecture, which have been discarded and transformed. This is partly due to the harsh conditions, but it succeeds in combining, quote, half functional but partly tasteful, unambiguous but not lacking in romance, because it is manifested in so many different but related ways. The result is that life feels, quote again, fuller and gayer, which is surely a true statement of what has always drawn people to live near water. Therefore, he says, when building by the seaside, be aware of the locality and behave accordingly. There is a subtext here too. English architecture has lost its soul. Modernism on its own won't succeed in finding it. The way back is also the way ahead, but be careful where you go. The seaside may be the best place to start from. Whether the destination was properly reached at any point is another matter. We might point to the South Bank exhibition at the Festival of Britain in 1951 as a kind of fulfillment of the nautical style, and to a certain extent this is true. But the critics of the festival had a point in finding it fit only for this particular temporary purpose and less apt for the sober business of building on solid ground. At the same time, in an article that Piper wrote jointly with another close friend, Geoffrey Grigson, in Axis magazine, there is a suggestion that the very idea of modern is, as such, is a form of category error. And here is, I think, the key statement of that. There is no past. There are no pictures painted in the past. Equally, there is no exclusive fair isle of the present. And I'll read the next bit, which comes later on, and this is the closing statement in the whole article. Accept so much, forget the year, though not the realities of the year, and paintings and writings simply become life. They can be felt thoroughly as life, and modern art can safely walk out from the gay white armor of its studio into the galleries and begin to learn. It's a very inclusive attitude. Don't shut yourself up like those abstractionists. That's their problem. They've limited life. They've left too much out. Go out and embrace what you find out there. So Piper's challenge was to architects of all persuasions, the Neo-Georgians or the Neo-Tudors, whose designs dominated the suburbs as much as the moderns, for whom the seaside was, at times at least, the right-looking setting for their porthole windows, horizontal lines, and supposedly robust concrete construction. But the question of what is the right style cannot really be answered in words, only in actions, through art or through architecture.